Welcome to Disgruntled Wargamer. I'm Tom, and today I'll be walking through another 3D print build, sharing my failures as well as my final success. Come with me as I learn by making mistakes. It all starts with an idea. I have a couple blockhouses from the old Signar Gravediggers army. They're now called the First Army, but I still prefer Gravediggers. It sounds so much cooler. They came with some flags, but I've lost mine. And all the new Signar Storm Legion guys with their cool banners had me thinking, is it time to make a new flag? Where to start? Well, for me, it's a trip down the YouTube rabbit hole. And dropping in at one of my favorite sites for Blender knowledge, in this case Artisans of All, have a tutorial on how to make a 3D printable flag complete with wind effect. It seems simple enough, but their flag is blank. How do I add on something like the Signar Swan as a symbol and have it move with the flag, but be raised up enough to paint without having to draw on it later? It starts with me tracing the swan in Blender and then cutting it into squares. This isn't the only time I'll do this. I'll figure out some things later, but for now, just know that I used the bisect tool to draw a grid through the model. I couldn't just straight up subdivide it in the way that it was at the moment because there were too many vertices placed along the edge. It was a complex shape and it just wouldn't subdivide. When I got done, I applied the cloth modifier like in the Artisans Evolve video and got the expected result. I tried it again with a plane pinned to a point in space by a series of vertices, and now I've got two pieces of cloth in my sim, but they aren't joined, so one just flaps like expected and the other falls. I couldn't find any tutorials on what to do next, specifically how to make a 3D piece of cloth and how to join the two 3D pieces of cloth together. So I started by making the swan 3D, extruding its vertices into another connected plane, and playing the sim to see what would happen. It didn't look great. It was folding, but I think it had trouble with all the vertices that were super close to each other on the edge. I realized that the scale I'm printing, I probably don't need them all and can get rid of some. Before I headed down that path, I decided to test the flat plane by adding a little heft. I extruded the plane into a 3D object and ran it through the sim. It puffed out like a pillow and crumpled at the place where the vertices were pinned. I now understand that the puffing effect is due to the planes on either side of the flag not being tied together in the physics model. Before I figured that out, I decided to see how joining the two meshes would work by using a union boolean. And of course, that didn't look right at all. The dead swan floating in space wasn't the effect that I was looking for. What happened was, I clicked on some more vertices for pinning and accidentally grabbed some of the swan's vertices. You see them pop up orange, and that's me selecting the vert group. After I figure out my mistake, I pull these vertices out of the group and let the swan fly again. It drops. And at this point, I'm not understanding why the swan and the plane don't bond when I run the boolean. I think it may have something to do with the fact that the verts weren't connecting, and also the swan not being a manifold object is probably coming into play when the boolean is running. So I go into the mesh and start poking around, and sure enough, the swan isn't really bonded. And maybe that's because when I ran the boolean, the swan mesh wasn't penetrating the plane mesh. I like to see real contact between the two, and in this case, I just floated it on top. You can tell because it falls apart during the sim, and because when you look at the inside and remove some faces, you get a second layer of faces instead of an open area where the two meshes meet. I reverted the plane back into being flat, and I ran the boolean again. This time, the swan is intersecting the plane and it looks pretty good. I add the pulls and the loops, following the Artisans Evolve tutorial, and it actually looks pretty fantastic. There will still be issues with the mesh when I try to make it 3D again. The solidify modifier won't work correctly because of the swan on top of the plane. The engine tries to solidify the swan as well, and I don't need that. I need a single back plane for the rear of the banner. I had trouble with the solidify tool and the subdivision tool. I think I want to try this again later with some stiffening of the edges on the swan to see if I can get something more similar to my original result, and I might try that with a second flag. I ended up extruding this mesh and adding back to it. When I did, it created weird bubbles where the swan would meet the plane, and the cloth kept billowing out. It was like it was a bag filled with water. The Artisans Evolve video doesn't explain why we're setting crease values, and I think it may have been related to how the edges were working, but they aren't running a sim of 3D cloth, just a plane, and then expanding the plane into a third dimension. Finally, I land on the idea of using internal springs. Those are the things that bind inside of the mesh to keep it from pulling apart or compressing together. This cloth is behaving better, but hasn't solved my problem of the swan creasing. Something to note is that the cloth isn't as wavy as before, and that's because the flat plane will act different than a 3D thing. If I want the dynamic look, I'm going to have to learn how to do it in a flat plane and then later expand it into a volume. This is me figuring out that it's not just the creasing, but also the weird vertices and the bad grid that I have with the swan. I also have a lot of areas where the bubbling is occurring even after deleting some vertices. Eventually I figure out that this is due to the meshes not being fully connected like I'd thought previously. If I had run a 3D analysis at this point, I'd see that most of the model is not manifold. Unfortunately, it took me hours to figure this one out. If I had had full time to dedicate to this project, I may have figured it out quicker. Unfortunately, I can't dedicate a full day to this project. I have to break it up over several periods, and I have to relearn what I learned the day before. So 3 days after I start this project, I'm back to nearly the beginning, and I'm playing with a knife tool to edit the topology of the mesh. And because I'm no expert, I mess this up. I decide that there's got to be a better way, and that involves cleaning up my original drawing. I eliminate many of the extra vertices and combine them. Remember, this print's going to be small, so it doesn't need that level of detail. When I get it all bonded together again and filled out, I get this cool effect. I also realize that the collision is keeping the center loop on the pole because I ran the pole through the loop. So I start attaching loops to the flag field and just let it hang from the loops. When I unpin the center, the whole thing starts flopping around, but the one that I set up holds. So I bond the rest of the loops, and look what we've got. I return to try to solve the subdivision problem. Stiffening the swan outline seems to work. It definitely holds its form better. However, I struggle with the overall lack of dynamic billowing that the original flat plane flag had. When I do this project again, I'm going to take it back to the flat plane, stiffen the swan outline, and then apply the solidify modifier after achieving the look I want. Also, I'll pin the verts at the top of the loops and probably change the loop physics by assigning them to a special group of vertices to make them look natural but hang without breaking through the collision model and slipping through the poles. Moving on, I blended some other assets from earlier projects to the flag and exported the STL. I worked out the tilt angles, trying to keep the model building on itself and limiting the number of supports. I let the slicer draw in its own supports, and this is what I got. It's a very lightweight model, so I'm not really worried about using tree supports. In the past, those tend to break away during builds, so I don't always trust them. I have a little lift off of the plate, probably excessive, but I find 6mm works well for me. So I set it up and I let it run. There's a lot that I can do differently next time. I'll probably post a quick video on the next one that I do, but I'm satisfied overall with how this looks today. I'd like to add some effects to the pole, maybe some lightning jumping off the Tesla coil and nodes. I'd like to explore the challenges I was having with the model in Blender, and something else just occurred to me. I probably should use real-life measurements when I model this. I've been modeling in millimeters with a literal 40mm object. When I blew it up to meters, I got this 40-meter object. That's a huge flag. That's probably why the physics weren't working exactly the way I wanted. So now I have a laundry list of improvements. and I think this is going to be my workflow for the next project. First, set it up in real life measurements. That means if I want a 1.5 meter long flag, I'm going to make it 1.5 meters long in the sim. I'm going to build the swan in 3D, then immediately stiffen the edge, merge it with the plane, add loops for the banner pole, pin part of the loop to the banner, run the wind simulator, freeze it where I want it, solidify, subdivide, bond to the pole, and then export. There are some other things I want to try in the future. I have flags with tassels, bunting at the top, or odd shapes, holes, tattered flags. I think there's a lot of room here to get silly. After I finish painting, I think this model is going to work out on the trencher blockhouse. That's all I have for today. If you have any ideas on what I should do next, how I could push my 3D print envelope, or how to improve my process, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.